Hi everyone, this is Long Vo. Today I'm analyzing one of my games played on August the 19th, 2012 against my brother Bao Vo. He's playing white and I'm playing black. He starts off with knight to f3 and I go d5. He goes g3 and I go knight to c6 with the idea of controlling the e5 square for later to push the e-pawn. He goes bishop to g2 and I push e5. Now he goes d3, I suppose to prevent me from advancing the pawn and to kick out the knight. So now I go bishop to c5, which is different from the way I used to play. The purpose of this move is to first of all put pressure on the f2 square because I do think he will be castling kingside. The second purpose is to have a little bit more control over the dark squares in the center, and the last purpose is to develop on the king side, and it also gives my knight another way to develop. And why that's relevant, you'll see my next move. Now he goes castles short, and I go f6. So this is also very different from the way I used to play, and I'll explain why. So by going f6, I'm overprotecting the center here. I do expect for him to eventually challenge my center, and this way my knight still has a way to develop, still protecting the center, and later on if there's the f5 that I could push eventually. But why am I playing f6 here instead of f5, which is the way I used to play? So back then I would think that, you know what, let's gain as much space as possible. Let's push the pawns and get a lot of space so I could develop all my pieces for crazy tactics and exert lots of pressure. But the problem with doing that is that I didn't understand how to maintain the center and why it was important, because what would happen was I would advance my pawns and spend time doing that, right? So once my pawns reached the 4th rank here, obviously it took me some moves, some tempos to do that, and then he, and develop my pieces and thinking that, oh, I have to connect my rooks as quickly as possible and start to exert pressure and think that it will lead to tactics. But as I would push for the center too early, he would create a couple of exchanges, and then eventually the minor pieces got exchanged, and before you know it, I would be left with like an isolated pawn or something, and he would simply gang up on it and win the game easily. And it was frustrating because I didn't understand why I kept losing. But now I've been reading up a little bit on pawn structures, and I'm trying to be more of a positional player versus a tactical player, because the tactics will come once your center or your position, your pawns are stable. Because once you advance a pawn, you can't really go backwards, right? So that's the difference in the way I'm playing today, and let's see what happens. So he goes c3, opening the diagonal for his queen, and I go a5. So here again is a move that I would not normally play, and what's the purpose of it? It's to prevent b4 from kicking my bishop away. And I do have the idea of perhaps later on pushing the b pawn here to make room for the light squared bishop to put more pressure on the king side. And plus, if the bishop is here, it indirectly protects the center, and that's my goal. So today's match is very positional, so not very tactical, but you'll see that it does lead to opportunities for tactics. So he goes d4. So I think maybe now he feels maybe a little bit of pressure, and he wants to counter the center and open it up so that he doesn't feel so cramped in here, which is okay, but I think it's a little bit premature because, well, first of all, I had no intention of moving any pawns to the 4th rank until I secure the center. So, well, maybe it's not premature because I think it's the right thing for him to do, because he does want to undermine the center right away so that then he has more space to develop, right? So I think that sort of makes sense. So I decide to retreat the dark squared bishop to a7 instead of exchanging. So the goal here is to avoid exchanges and let him spend the temples, taking my material, and then I would simply recapture. So he goes d takes e, and so I can either take with the pawn or the knight, and obviously the best move in this case would be to take with the pawn. So if I took with the knight, he could take back, then once I take with the pawn, then my d pawn is hanging, and that's not good. So I decide to take with f takes e. This sort of adds another pawn to the center, still maintaining that strong center. Now it opens up the f6 square for the knight to develop this way. It opens up the f file, so if I castle, then we have an open file for the semi-open file for the rook to exert pressure on his king side. So he goes knight to a3. Now normally I would want to connect my rooks as quickly as possible and all that stuff, thinking that was, you know, quick development, right? And normally I would have played f6 or something, but if I did that, he would simply pin the knight, and it's really difficult to get out of something like this because now, right, so the knight is supposed to defend that center d pawn, but how do you get out of something like this, right? So if you challenge him, you know, he would simply exchange. Whoops. So even if I took with the queen, I don't want to exchange minor pieces at this point because I feel that I have a good, strong center. I want to maintain it. I need my minor pieces to maintain that. And eventually, if I ever want to, when I'm ready to push and exert pressure on the 4th rank, I need those minor pieces. So trying to be more tactical here, developing the knight here is premature. I still have the intention of developing, but I have to do it smartly. So I decide to go h6. So normally it's against what people would think, right? They think, oh, don't make too many pawn moves, but you know, you have to develop smartly as well, because if I simply develop my knight and it gets pinned and exchanged, that's not a good thing either, because I need all my minor pieces for the kingside attack. So he goes knight to b5, attacking my dark squared bishop, and same thing, his knight is sort of alone, so I don't see how it could make any threats on its own like that. I don't think it's a very good move, and also I want to avoid exchanges at this point. Now going back to b8 would sort of slow down my development, and the bishop here is kind of blocked in. It's not very good, so I decided to go bishop to c5 in a more central position, and because his d pawn is gone, he can no longer challenge it, and because I already played a5 to prevent b4. I think this is a good square for the dark square bishop. I can always retreat to the king side for defense. So he goes h4. So here I think maybe he thinks that I'm trying to launch like a king side attack somehow, trying to open up the h file, which I used to do in the past, you know, and castle queen side. So I think maybe that's what he was thinking. So he played h4. So I think now h4 sort of weakens the dark squares on his king side, and I think the structure here is quite stable. So I think moving that pawn here is a mistake. I go knight to f6 finally, safely I guess, knowing that the pin is no longer there. Also controlling the center, overprotecting it a bit, and preparing for kingside castling. Now he goes a4, which I think is also not very productive. I guess because the knight is not under attack. This is not a true outpost, because eventually my idea is to move my knight away to push the c pawn. So I think I'm not sure why that he played that move. Maybe he's thinking of doing something here on the queen side eventually. So I castle king side, and he goes queen to c2. So he's putting pressure on that diagonal here, but the light squared bishop is not really in the attack. So the queen there, so I'm not sure what it really does, or maybe he's thinking of opening the d1 square for the rook to eventually put pressure on the d pawn here, and so I go knight to e4. So this is a little tactic here, because now that he moved the h pawn here, he created a weakness. He lost a defender for the g pawn, and because the f pawn is pinned, if now I take, he can't take back, right? So this would really cripple his king side, and eventually the queen can come in at a later date if the knight is exchanged. So I felt that I was ready to start doing something tactically. I felt the center was pretty strong, stable at this point, even though my light square bishop and the a rook are undeveloped. So I felt I was ready to start something, putting pressure. So he did see that, and he went e3. So now the purpose of the knight going there, I mean, this was a tactic, but it wasn't, you know, the most brilliant tactic. So I'm not surprised that he saw it, and by going knight to e4, I'm sort of inducing or forcing him almost to play e3, now weakening the light squares, right? So now the knight here only has that light squared bishop to defend. So later on, going back, I don't have a problem with that. Now bishop to f5 develops the bishop, x-rays the queen, and right, so eventually I do want to move my queen to d7 to perhaps exchange the light squared bishop there, because that's the only defender of the light squares around the king. The dark squares are sort of protected with the pawns, so that light squared bishop is really important. So that's why I have my eye on that for later. So he doesn't want to be x-rayed, so he goes queen to b3, x-raying my king. So now I have to be a little bit careful because now that bishop is protecting the knight, but eventually that knight is not really well protected anymore by this pawn because of the pin. So that's something I keep in the back of my head. Also, by going queen to b3, he is exerting pressure on the d5 pawn. I do think he's going to launch some counterattack in the center. Rook to e8. I think this is a mistake. Well, not a mistake, but it's sort of not that productive. The reason being, I wanted to move my knight back here to push the pawn and kick away the knight, and being more positional. Now I'm creating a pawn chain towards the king side so I could attack, so that was the idea. But if I move my knight anywhere, then this pawn hangs, right? So I thought that if I added a defender to the center, so same thing, the theme here is to overprotect the center, I would be able to move the knight. But then if I did that, I would simply block the defender, right? So I sort of realized that later, that the rook there is not really defending. But now I do feel a little bit of pressure here because the queen is stuck protecting the c pawn here, and now she's stuck protecting the d pawn. So she's being overloaded here, and that's why I figured if I can somehow move the knight back here to eventually protect that pawn, it would help free up the queen. So that's the way I'm thinking. So he goes rook to d1, putting pressure on that d5 pawn there. To be honest, my move when we played was here, and then so that pawn hung, and because the goal is not really to have like a perfect game here, he did let me take the move back, so instead I went bishop to e6. Now I am still blocking my defender here, so see, this rook here is probably not that good there. Anyways, I protected my d pawn this way, and I'm x-raying his queen. So I guess the rook does have a purpose because it is defending the light square bishop. So if I ever advance to open up the diagonal, the queen would be x-rayed. So it caused him to move back to queen c2, and my knight here is good. Here it has like an outpost, sort of controlling, neutralizing that dark squared bishop, putting pressure here if ever this pawn leaves. But I wanted the knight to be here, to be a bit more aggressive. So I went knight to f6. It looks like I'm giving up a good square, but the purpose of this is to also overprotect the d pawn, because I do want to free up the knight here, right? So I do want to somehow protect this pawn, and get my queen into the action, get the other rook in somehow. So the knight here is sort of a passive move, going backwards a bit, but it's also, the idea here is to open up the e4 for that massive pawn chain that I'm preparing, right, so he can't really stop it right now. If he goes back, if he goes e4, I'll simply take. So this is preparing for this move as well. So I think I'm ready at this point to to take the center permanently. But he was quite surprised with my knight retreating. So he goes bishop to d2. So I'm not sure if this was a good move. Well, he is connecting the rooks, completing development, but it's not really active here. Or maybe he had nothing else to do. So now I go bishop to g4, putting a little bit of pressure on the knight, pinning it, and that's my way of releasing the tension on this pawn here. I felt that perhaps if I push right away, I don't know, may have been premature. Right, he could have gone here. Then what? Right? He's offering exchanges. That's not what I want, right? Because now the light square bishop and the other knight are double attacked. So I mean, I can't stop him from exchanging. So that's my idea. So now by playing bishop to g4, it now it frees up the rook to defend. Now my knight can, well, the idea is to push the pawn so the knight can go here instead now. Once the pawn goes up, it solves the problem of protecting the e pawn. So now he retreats the rook to c1, doesn't like the x-ray, and now I push e4. So now I'm permanently taking control of the center. The only pawn that can challenge it is the f pawn eventually. He goes knight to d4, but because now it's not a pin anymore, right? It's not a fork. I'm able to advance my knight to e5, quite aggressive, taking good control of the light squares around the king. The knight is controlling the light square as well, so it's not. I'm still fighting for it, but I'm avoiding exchanges, and by moving this knight here, it opens up for c6 to kick out his knight. Now he goes queen. Wait, hold on. He goes queen to b3. So now, right? So it's putting pressure on the d pawn, but the rook is no longer there. The bishop going here is probably not very good, blocking off his semi-open file for the rook. So I don't think the queen can do anything here. Plus I have my knight and my queen. But he is x-raying the king, so perhaps he's thinking of later on challenging this pawn here. And if he takes, I take with the knight, he takes back and he's safe, right? So I can't take back because of the pin. So that's fine. So I push for c6, kicking away his knight. And he retreats to a3. His only good square. And of course, same thing. That's a bad knight. My bishop is strong here. No need to exchange. Finally, completing my development on move 38 with queen to d7. So even though it took me that long to complete development, it's quite stable. So you see how my center here is strong. The only threat is f3 here, and the rooks are connected. My next idea here is to get the a rook into the game by doing a mini rook lift here, and then bringing the rook to the f file. So he retreats the knight to c2 because he's trying to relocate it to a more useful square, and he's probably feeling pressure around the king side. So my little rook lift with rook to e7. It may seem like it's kind of a useless move, but it's also adding a defender to the b pawn, because if eventually I exchange light squared bishops, that pawn is still defended. So knight to e1, I think he's putting more pressure on that f3 square for his push, because he does need to, do something about this center here. But of course, that's what I want. I want him to open up the king side to weaken the other pawns, and then the dark squares around the king would be very weak. So finally, rook to f8, putting pressure on the f file, and pawn to f3, attacking my light squared bishop, challenging my center. And now bishop to h3, offering an exchange, well, forcing an exchange, and instead of taking, and then I would simply take back with the queen in a really aggressive position, threatening this one, the g3 pawn. Of course, he doesn't want to take, so he goes f takes e. Works out for me because now this becomes an open file. The knight can take once the bishops are off the board. Takes with tempo, attacking my knight would take with tempo, attacking the dark squared bishop and the pawn. So now bishop takes g2, king takes g2, knight takes e4. So now, obviously now lots of threats here. So he feels that pressure. Knight to f3. Same thing, offering to exchange. And the king is still there, and then he would eventually bring the other major pieces for defense. And I played queen to g4. I think it's a very strong move, threatening a strong check here. Also adding another attacker, so I have 3 attackers on this knight. So the knight is going to fall no matter what. So here he could defend with the rook, but then he's in trouble. And I think here we were unable to finish this game because I had to leave. But going home, I used an engine to analyze this position, and it's totally winning for black. So the only move the engine recommended is bishop to e1, defending the g3 pawn, and then knight takes f3, queen to d1, pinning the knight, and adding another attacker so the other knight can go in. Knight takes g3, and knight takes f3. Knight goes to e2, discover check. So I'm not gonna talk too much here because it's not really my game anymore. Now it's just the engine giving some probabilities, the best moves, and at this point black is totally winning. King to h2, bishop to d6 check, knight to e5 to block, sacrificing the knight. Bishop takes e5 check, bishop to g3 to block, totally desperate. Bishop takes g3 check, king to g2, rook takes e3. White is done. Queen takes d5 check, c takes d, rook to d1. I don't think there's anything he can do here. I guess he's trying to somehow get the rooks involved here desperately. Rook to f2, check, king to h1, and queen takes h4, checkmate.